We have the uber elites talking about how gold is a barbaric relic, but then behind the scenes, as was quoted, I believe, in Business Insider, they're buying gold Italian job style. You got to ask yourself, well, what do those people and what do those sovereigns know that the average American doesn't know? I'll tell you what, it's that the dollar and the dollar payment system and the world reserve currency as it exists, it's reaching the end of its life.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and back with us today is Fabian Calvo from FabianForLiberty.com and TheNoteHouse.us. Fabian, thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet, Elijah. Nice to be on.
All right, well, previously we have discussed a lot about what you call the global economic reset, and you've recently stated that there's two big signs that the global economic reset is coming. The first one you discussed was the China and Russia alliance. Did you want to talk a little bit about this?
Certainly, yeah. So, I think many of the listeners know things about the BRIC nations, which really the foundation of BRICS is Russia and China. I've been talking at length about this kind of new Eastern NATO, if you will, that is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also includes Russia. It includes China. They're also talking about bringing in India and Pakistan. So these are things that I think just 5 years ago, the world would have thought never possible. I think 5-10 years ago, the world would have never thought this close alliance between Russia and China would be possible, considering they had some falling out in the 1960s. But what we've seen is the sanctions, and whether people want to, I think a good question to ask is, are the Western sanctions that have been imposed against the Russians over Ukraine and all that just insanity, are those being done purposely to create this new alliance, to forge a stronger alliance between those two countries? Because, at least in my opinion, I think many of the uber elites of this world really want to profit from that alliance between the Russians and the Chinese. And we've seen that's exactly what's happened. Since the sanctions were levied against Russia, Russia's actually drawn closer to China. China's definitely taken advantage of that relationship. They had in May signed a $400 billion energy deal. Now it's been doubled in the last couple of weeks. They actually doubled that almost to $750 billion. We know China needs energy to grow their expanding economy, and Russia has it. But it doesn't just end there. The Russians are also selling some of their most advanced weaponry to the Chinese, I think to help buffer their expansion into the South China Sea. So we clearly see here a relationship that is there's a benefit for both parties involved, and they are, I believe, working on contingency plans for a fall of the U.S. dollar and from the fallout that will happen throughout the West when that event does happen.
Now, you've also said that the dismantling of OPEC is also a major sign of the global economic reset. Did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I should have prefaced this question and the one prior with the a video that I posted on my YouTube channel about a year ago, 7 warnings that the global economic reset is coming. And, these were things that I talked about back then, and now you've just seen them in the news. They've been in the news for a while. I should add that another thing that the Russians and Chinese have done is, in light of the sanctions against these big financial Russian institutions, one of the big banks in the Chinese Import-Export Bank has given billions upon billions of dollars of lines of credit to these Russian institutions so that they can buy Chinese consumer goods, basically. So these are things that, have been happening for some time, Elijah, but I think the momentum is definitely gaining traction. Now with OPEC, I think OPEC is something that is really an old style cartel. OPEC is an oil cartel, like the Federal Reserve is a dollar cartel. They fix prices, and they basically collude to keep the price to fix prices. Well, that's beginning to change as well. It's beginning to change in many ways, one of them being this growing civil war that is about to break out, I believe, in the Middle East between countries like Iraq and Iran, or Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are all OPEC members. But at the same time, we've seen the Saudis, who basically are an oil company, that is their economy, kind of getting freaked out that the United States has actually stepped up as the number one producer of oil, with a record number of oil rigs in this country right now drilling for oil and using shale and everything else. Well, for those oil wells in America to be profitable, they have to be running, oil needs to be running at about $60 to $65 a barrel, roughly. And what we've seen over the last 3-4 weeks has been the Saudis basically dumping oil on the market to expand their market share, but also doing that because they know that they can pretty much bring production in America, or a significant amount of the production in America, to a real screeching halt. That's what they're trying to do. So it is not being done, as many were suggesting, to hurt Russia. It's actually being done to hurt America. So another thing I should add with the Saudis is that the Saudis' number one buyer of oil is the Chinese. It's no longer America. So we see these countries beginning to recognize, I think, how the world's changing. We see these countries that are members of OPEC having real different views on how they see the world. And I think with, going back to Russia and China, Vladimir Putin not too long ago announced the formation of a new energy union. So I think you could potentially see a lot of these countries like Venezuela, Iran, actually go over to the Chinese and the Russians and begin to want to sell their oil in the Chinese currency, or for that matter, maybe even the Russian currency.
You discussed at the beginning of this interview that it seems like China and Russia are preparing for the death of the dollar. Now, definitely the U.S. government doesn't want China to give up on the U.S. dollar. Now, on your video blog, you've actually discussed about how the U.S. government is giving money to China and giving China sweet deals on American real estate to kind of keep intact the relationship between China and the U.S. so that China doesn't start dumping the U.S. currency.
Yeah, so they're basically bribing them with financial incentives, and those are that, hey, if you want to buy the Waldorf Astoria for $2 billion, the propaganda that'll be put out by the state-run media is that the U.S. is scrutinizing the Chinese insurance company that is buying this historic New York landmark hotel, when just the opposite is true. We know now for at least a couple of years, they've allowed the Chinese government to buy everything from major food producers like Smithfield to all kinds of different defense contracting companies to electric battery companies, all U.S. based. The Chinese are making huge investments in the auto industry as well in Detroit. And they're also making huge investments in real estate in the United States. A lot of that money is put together by U.S. banks. I'd go one step further based on the talks that I've had with sources, is a lot of government money is actually being funneled to these big banks that in turn is going to Chinese investors, i.e. the Chinese Communist government, to buy up this real estate and again give them sweetheart deals so they don't dump debt or that they don't continue to deleverage U.S. Treasury holdings into gold or into other asset classes. Now, I talked about this when the whole Bundy Ranch thing broke out, Elijah, because back then I said that the Department of Land Management, the Bureau of Land Management, was actually going through this process of categorizing land across the U.S. Because they're eventually going to collateralize it. And they're going to collateralize it by building, in the West at least, a lot of these big solar farms. Well, the Chinese are lead investors in those solar farms, and that's just another example of this. So yeah, look, the U.S. government and the economics of this government is an absolute train wreck. Any legitimate government would be putting in right now emergency would be basically going after the big banks that are creating these 70-to-1 deleveraged or leveraged derivative portfolios. They would be preparing the American people for what's on the horizon financially. But instead, they're taking an approach of extend and pretend by bribing other countries to basically continue to play in this dollar trading system. I should add one other quick point here, Elijah, that the result of an OPEC breakup will mean that oil transactions will not be settled in the US dollar internationally any longer.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That's it for part 1. Make sure to click here to subscribe so you will be notified when part 2 is released.